Audacity. Get back here.
All right. Broadcast is live. We good?
Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, as long as I sound okay, then we're good.
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, good.
All
You
right.
ready?
3,
Right.
2, 1, go.
Cool.
Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick,
I'm Todd Slater.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
and we are your
We're your
hosts.
host.
We are recording this on the evening of October 28th, 2015, and in this episode of the podcast, we're going to talk about source control. So, source control, we all use it. Hopefully, we all use it. But sometimes it seems like we all use it a little bit differently. Everybody's got their own kind of ways of working with source control. So today, Chris, Todd, and I are going to chat about what exactly source control means to us and how we use it in our day-to-day development. So, Todd, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yes, we've all dealt with source control, and all the things that go with it. When I think about source control, I think about a couple different things. One is obviously storing all your code in one place, but I also kind of think about it from a bigger picture. It's about collaborating across different members of the same team. For a long time, I've been developing for a very long time. We used to have developers in the same room as you, so it was very easy to collaborate. But now over the course of 20 or so years, I now work with developers from all over the world and developers from different companies. So having source control or a bigger piece of some kind of collaborative environment is almost key to the day-to-day success of what we're trying to do. If we were trying to email files or FTP files back and forth, it would be very inefficient. So that's how I sort of look at source control.
Yeah. Have you ever actually worked on a project where you emailed files back and forth, or just copied zip files or created copies of
Yes.
folders or things?
Yes. And for a long time, I had a couple other developers worked on the project, and the first day I got there, I'm like, we need source control now.
Yeah,
We
right.
get the backup of the source control, make some changes, upload it to them, and then it'd be 3 months in between. It's like, no, we need real-time access to the code. And
Yeah,
this is only a few years ago. It isn't like the only barrier was just communication. It was
yeah,
a human barrier, not a technical barrier.
yeah, right. So,
Yeah.
Chris, what does source control mean to you?
Well, I think it's really obvious to talk about us controlling like our Visual Studio projects, right? I mean, for quite a while now, we've had pretty decent integration. I think we've relied on integration in Visual Studio to say, okay, I'm connected to, maybe it was, even if you were connected to like Visual Source Safe, remember that?
Oh,
Or
horror stories. I got many, many horror stories.
or TFS or something else. Because one of the big nightmares, I think, being a Visual Studio based developer, was that you didn't have any kind of guidance as to what exactly should go into source control. And I don't know if you guys, kind of off the top of your head, let's say you didn't have source control interface integration. Do you know what files to commit and which ones not to? Because I actually have developed, that's that little spidey sense of, okay, not the .suo and not the bin and the obj and not that csproj.user, right? But I think part of that was because the Visual Studio came about before wide adoption, I think, of even Visual Source Safe, and so we've been playing catch up, at least in that environment, to try to get to a place where you don't have to play this pick and choose game. And there are some other environments that I think have gotten there, and especially a lot of the open source world.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the before we had source control. I've seen the case where people don't use the integration directly. They just open, for example, TFS, they open Source Control Explorer and start adding directories without realizing they're actually adding other files they don't want.
Yeah,
So
right.
yeah, definitely there is. It's like anything in Visual Studio. There's a huge benefit to having everything integrated in a great IDE, but sometimes it makes you blind to what you really are doing under the covers. And so if you're not aware of it, and when you get outside of that comfort zone, whether we're using a different tool or you're just using the File Explorer to check things in, all of a sudden now you're checking other files you don't want to check in. It's like a handicap you in a way. or prevents you. It's very easy. It's right click in, I'm done. Right? I don't have to really even think about it. But when you get into that file system approach or a different kind of source control system or different IDE, all of a sudden now you're like, well, what am I checking in? What do I need to check in?
Yeah. I think something that might be like right up Jess's alley is that like today we have NuGet, right? So a lot of our third-party package and dependency management, we're not committing those files anymore. But do you, at least this is actually, well, this is the question I was going to ask is that do you find, is it that there still some organizations that you're finding that just maybe flat out aren't using NuGet, or even if they are, have some kind of mistrust and say, no, we're going to commit the binary DLLs to lock down the version of some dependency?
Yeah, when it comes to figuring out what to check in and what to not, especially in regards to NuGet packages, I know a lot of people, when NuGet first came out, a lot of people just kind of assumed that you had to check in the packages, right? And I think that was just because that was what they were used to. Like if your project needs an assembly, a DLL to compile, then that assembly needs to be in source control. Right? That was just the way things were done. Otherwise, where else are you going to get it? Well, then the answer to where else are you going to get it became NuGet, right? Go ahead and get it from NuGet. So very early on, if not incredibly early on, like in the beginning, NuGet added the option to kind of automatically go and download packages when you first got your opened up your project or went to go compile your project. And so now you didn't need to include those packages in your in source control anymore, which saved you a lot of space, right? A lot of getting the same files over and over again, checking in new versions of the file, which depending on the source control system, actually took up a decent amount of space. And so instead, you just check in your packages config file, right? So every time you use NuGet to add a package to the package config, or rather, every time you add a NuGet package to your solution, it adds a line to that package config, which is just the name of the package and the version. And so whenever you kick up your project, it goes out to the internet and goes to NuGet and downloads everything you need, right? And so that is great as long as you have access to the internet on, especially your build server, right? So in many corporate environments, I presume, at least some of the corporate environments I've been in, your build server, even if your development machines do have access to the internet, your build servers may not, right? They may be on a different subnet or something like that. They may have different firewall rules. And so, all that kind of just goes out the window, and you're back to, if you need an assembly in order to compile your project, well, it better be checked in. And so you kind of lose that benefit. But I mean, if your build server has access to the internet and it has access to NuGet to be able to get those packages, then ideally all you're checking in are changes to that package config file, and even the build server can go and grab them live on every build.
I've also seen cases where it's again, it's not a technological problem, it's a human problem. There's trust of NuGet. There's, like you said, access to being able to download the packages, but there's also a bunch of legacy. I've seen cases where people for years actually checked in the DLLs of all the assemblies they were referencing. This is like pre-NuGet days. And their main driver was they wanted everyone to be stuck with the same version, or they wanted everybody to be having the consistent version. They were concerned that one developer would have DLL X, version X, and I'd have Y.
Well, that's really important, right? I mean, that's crucial.
Yeah, it is really important. I think there's still, with NuGet, it's, for a lot of people, it's still kind of new, even though NuGet's been around now, 3 or 4 years probably. It's still like
at least 5 years.
It's a change how they did things, right? They were used to putting all the DLLs in the source control. So just using NuGet, their instinct is put all this in the source control. And I've had cases where people are like, all right, we put this in source control, but now it's in 6 places. And we're like, well, that was always a problem. NuGet was trying to make it easier for you to solve that problem. You've reverted back to how you used to do it. And I think it's a big thing, particularly when we talk about source control, is I think for a lot of developers, the big mistake they make is thinking source control is just about checking files in. They don't understand, and kind of how I started the conversation, it's about collaborating, right? I mean, a lot of the source control systems allow you to do other things than just stick files in somewhere.
I completely agree. It's a great way to collaborate, and it acts as a middleman to kind of break any ties that might happen, right? And say, I got in there first. I got it. Yes. Well, No, even if you did write that line of code 5 days ago, you didn't check it in until yesterday. So, and I checked it in the day before. So, technically I was first, even though I only wrote it the day before, right? So, but to me, it actually more than that. I definitely agree with you, Todd. I'm not disagreeing with you, but more than that, for me, it's more of a safety net, right? So for me, it's more if it works right now and I check it in, I'll always be able to get back to this point. Right, so I've heard it referred to as like a save game. When you have, before you go into the big boss at the end, you want to save your game first. So if you die when you're trying to kill the boss, then you can go back to right before, and you're not losing all of your progress and all of that time and energy that you put in to get there. And I mean, the downside is, if you get further enough along and you start adding new features, making changes, and then that goes bad or that goes wrong, and you go back to that point where you checked it in and it worked, you may lose a lot of that new work. You may lose those new features. But, I mean, the fact that they were broken and not working in the first place means that they weren't really that good to begin with. And, I mean, honestly, sometimes it's better to just do it again. But, I mean, if you're checking in often enough, then you're bound to not lose that much work at once.
Yeah, I've seen in cases where we're talking about NuGet, where different groups across the same company, they'll have shared DLLs. Maybe one group is more of an enterprise type architecture group. They might create controls or whatever, some kind of shared resources. And instead of relying on source control to build those out every time, they want a lockdown version of that. So they actually produce a DLL and force people through checking into source control those DLLs. And I think it makes sense on the surface, but when you think about it from the bigger picture, why are we doing it? It seems more like it's a legacy thing. And I think that's, as we go through this conversation, I'm going to start peeling out some pet peeves that I've had over the years, that even just this last week or so I've run into. And I think a lot of it's to do with developers either not trusting source control. I know back in the days of Visual Source Safe, it was very easy to corrupt the database and then you lost all your code.
Which defeats the whole purpose.
Yes. But I mean, all the modern things, TFS, Git, and stuff, they're all. I don't think that's really a problem anymore. But the legacy is still there to developers. I also think too, developers are kind of hesitant to check things in often because they're like, it's not done yet. And to me, that's like a huge pet peeve to me. To me, source control, as long as it builds, and if you're creating tests, they all run. It's okay not to be 100% done. I would rather have code in a, like I said, a stable state, but you're doing your progress, as opposed to the case where someone makes a bunch of changes, and then they don't check it in for 2 weeks, but I need to work on some other features that relate it, so I start working on stuff, and all of a sudden now you have this like weird state of merging, and then all of a sudden he checks his changes in, and your stuff breaks. It's like, if you're not going to be checking in, to me, almost a cadence of at least once a day, if not every couple days, then you're not fully taking advantage of what source control can provide to you.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't run into so much developers not trusting the source control system in the first place, that it might get corrupt or something. But even though I've definitely run into scenarios where my Visual Source Safe database got corrupted, which was just horrible. I mean, you just don't trust it. But I think at least for the developers that I've been working with lately, like that's so far behind us that either one, they are too new to even have experienced that, or they've gotten over it. They've had enough experience with other ones, TFS, Git, all the modern ones that you pointed out, that they have it's regained their trust again. But I mean, just to basically just echo what you just said, that is absolutely the problem that I've had with other developers just really being embarrassed or ashamed to share their changes or something like that. Like they want to make sure it's perfect before checking it in for the whole world to see, right? For a lot of developers, it seems like, and it is, that this commit operation to the central source control repository is just welcoming, mocking, and it's sharing your code, it's sharing your thought. You did all of this stuff on your local machine, you made all this work, and you're the only one who's ever seen it. And so, it's been private to this point, and then all of a sudden you're opening it up, and now it's public, and it's ready for criticism and everything. And so people seem to be hesitant to share that. But I mean, frankly, we're going to get into branching and merging later, but my comment to that is, well, just make a branch. If you're really that concerned, make a branch, because I absolutely agree with you, Todd, in that check in on a regular cadence, once or twice or once every 1 or 2 days. But honestly, I go even further than that. I'm like at least once a day, if not, once before lunch and once in the afternoon at the very least. I'm more like a twice a day person
Yeah.
at least.
The way I do things is what I found to work is most of the project I'm on, I tend to be the tech lead, so I can to control what developers are going to work on what. I actually give them very small tasks so that they're kind of forced to check in. Here, you're going to go work on this screen. You're going to put the grid on here to do X. When you're done, check it in. And then when they're done, all right, that's checked in, great. Now you're going to do the next task. And I found it works to, I hate to say the word micromanagement, but sometimes it feels like you need to micromanage certain people, and then eventually they get it. It's almost like I said before, I don't think developers don't want to do it. It's just like we tend to hold on to this legacy of I did this before, this worked. Now I don't want to go check something else in, or I don't want to have to do these other things.
Yeah.
So,
well, so part of what we're talking about here is checking in too often or checking in not enough. Now let's talk about. I'm curious what you guys think about checking in too often. Do you ever find that you can be a little too aggressive and you're providing changes that they do build, the system's still stable, but you're not really providing any value with this small change? It is giving you, I got this little piece done. Is that possible? Do you think it's possible to check in too aggressively? Have you ever found that it can disrupt the team and that you're seeing a lot of little check-ins going into, and since we're not talking about branching at this point, going into the trunk, whether you're like on TFS or Subversion, and I'm going to just throw those two out there.
Well, and I think you just mentioned the trunk and a branch. I think we're going to get back to that terminology too. If listeners aren't familiar with that, we'll get back and explain that. So, but I think that you do run the risk of polluting the history. In other words, if you want to go back and see when something was changed and you have a whole bunch of little commits, it does make it a little bit harder to find that. But frankly, no, I mean not really. The biggest risk that I've seen, practically speaking, is that you are so rushed to check in and you're so frivolous with checking in that every line of code you change, you just go ahead and check it in, sometimes without even building the solution first. So the big caveat that you just said is, as long as it builds, no, that's not what I see often, right? I see people who are so eager to check in, which is great, that they just skip the build. And when I say people, sometimes that people is me.
Yes.
Right? I have done this before, right? I've been so eager to check in that I literally just kind of forgot, in air quotes.
Yes.
I just rushed right through it and I didn't even build and I checked in, and nothing can disrupt the team more than stupid bugs and stupid breaking code that just gets in just because you were careless. That's all it really comes down to. Even if you had the best intentions, you're still careless.
I think just to build upon what you're saying there a little bit is, there's sometimes this pressure to check things in, which is checking something in that's broke is really, really bad. But also the idea that I think a lot of it has to do with your sort of how you work, right? In most of my project, I'm the architect. So I'm jumping between different pieces at different times. So I almost have to check my changes in much faster because I'm working on something that 3 other developers need. So I need to get that piece in quickly. When we talk about source control, one of the things I think that I've always done, and I found it makes source control much better, people check in their code, but they don't get latest right away and still make sure it builds. It built for me, I checked my changes in, I got latest, and then I left.
Yeah.
You need to actually get back to we'll call it the trunk state, and I think we should probably talk about trunk and branch in the next segment here. You need to get back to what does source control have, match it up, and work. So one of the huge pet peeves I have is it's getting source control out and not building, but also sometimes what I'll do is I will actually clear everything off my machine and do a fresh git, and when that doesn't build, it just drives me nuts. It's like we don't have the fresh build, we don't have the ability to build that code instantaneously from source control, which to me is one of the advantages of having source control, is being able to, anybody can get latest, deploy, and off you go.
So I do that often. I actually make a point of I want to be in a world where I'm not afraid to hit delete, wipe the whole thing out, and get it again. And it's something I actually make a personal point of doing. And sometimes that might cause a little friction with the team I'm working on because maybe it's kind of unusual and weird to them. But the reality is it's a place I want to be, where at any moment, even like right now, I don't care that I've deleted the source folder because I can just go get it. And then you brought up the second point. It's something that a term that I don't think I made it up, but I say it all the time is F5 ability is, and that for me, that's an integral part of it too. I want to be able to pull the code out, hit F5, and it's going to work.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole lot that goes into that that's way beyond the scope of source control, making your projects, and we talked a little bit about it with package management, but that's not it. I mean, we could do an entire series making your projects low friction.
Like
right.
Yeah. But so, I think, go ahead, finish.
Well, I was going to say, as web developers, we have some resources that aren't text files. Oftentimes it might be images. I'd be curious to think if you can think of some other resources that are binary files. I mean, image files, they don't merge. You can't diff them really. I mean, yes, there are imaging diff tools, but they're the kinds of things you just check over top of one another. And so I'm curious if there's anything the two of you have run across that's helped you decide when not to commit a part of a project to source control and instead manage it a different way, some other type of content management, and whether that's images or audio. I've been really curious about whether in some cases, and maybe this would be websites that are a little bit more media driven, where you say, hey, this isn't really part of the code base, this is more of the content management. Has that ever happened to either of you two?
So I do have specific cases, but I want to talk about what you're talking about there. In those kind of sites, the content itself really isn't code, it's content, right? And usually the CMS system provides a mechanism to do that. Even the code itself, it becomes content. There isn't really a separate source control. And I've actually worked a lot of CMS sites, and getting those sites to actually check in the source control, whether it's people or figuring out how to do it, the barrier there is a lot harder. Because it isn't just code files. Sometimes you need the database, or if you're like something in SharePoint, you need to have 7,000 configuration files all over the place, and if you don't have them in the right place when you go to deploy somewhere, things just break.
Right. Configuration files, database, and so this sounds like a judgment call depending on how you've architected your project.
Yeah, or the environment you're working in. If you're working in SharePoint or CMS, there are different things you need to deal with. Specifically, the binary files I've worked with are PDF files. I work at a lot of different places where people have chose to use PDF for help, only because it's not really code. Instead of building an HTML page to store it, it's much easier for the end users or somebody to maintain it. And for the most part, we more than likely check those in, and that's because of the F5 factor you talked about, the ability to get this code out, deploy it without needing anything else. But there's a drawback to that. So you kind of have to decide what makes sense. I think if you have a good build process, you could easily pull that from somewhere else. But as developers, at least for the people that I work with, we tend to work with TFS, it's convenient to stick it in there. I have had cases where we had non-developers working with TFS and they were storing Word docs. They were actually storing the functional specs in TFS, and still to this day that baffles me. Seeing some business user open Visual Studio to be able to check a Word doc in. They never had Visual Studio for any other purpose other than checking files in. So in that case, that's not the right solution. So I think it's to do with a couple different things. What is it? Is it actually being deployed? And then what is the sort of like work collaboration environment?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, you mentioned the term content before, and for me, content means that it doesn't affect the functionality. If you basically removed the content or replaced it with some kind of placeholder, your application would still function just fine without it, right? It literally doesn't matter what's in that file as long as that file exists. And can be rendered some fine. Yeah, that pointer is there, something exists. And so, so I've had a couple of different experiences with this, and one of them, not one of my experiences, but one of my jobs, I was actually involved in some pretty heavy experiential stuff, right? So we were doing like Unity applications, or XNA applications, that kind of stuff, where we were building really highly immersive user experiences, and so you could kind of touch things, you could drag things around, resize things, and all this stuff. So there was functionality. The line between functionality and just content was very, very blurred. So you had things like sprites, and these were the things that you interacted with. These are the things that you touched and dragged around and resized and everything. And if those sprites weren't right, then the application wouldn't work, right? So like if you need, it didn't matter what color, what pixels were actually getting rendered out, but something needed to be rendered out, and it needed to be a particular size, and it needed to be a particular shape. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that touch point, that reference point to actually interact with, right? And it would affect the functionality. So in other words, the application would still function the same. That artifact that you were rendering would still render with a certain a hitbox, right? So you could still drag it and resize it and everything, and it would actually resize, but it wouldn't look like it was resizing. It would look like it was all screwed up, and therefore the functionality, the net effect is that the functionality was messed up, right? So that was a very highly immersive application versus something like a website, which just shows arbitrary HTML, or as you mentioned, a PDF, right? You just, at this point in the application, you display this PDF, and it literally just doesn't even matter what's in the PDF because there's no functionality. Assuming the PDF doesn't have any macros or any interaction. It doesn't have just content. Yeah, just content. And in those kind of cases, for those kind of cases, I have checked in basically just blank placeholders, like literally PDFs that have that file name that just say content goes here, right? So to your point, the F5 ability, yes, the developers need to be able to get it and just hit F5 and everything is there in order for them to run. But when they get to that point in the application, they just see a placeholder that says, content goes here. I've also used what you're talking about, Todd, where you have kind of a more enhanced build process where you automate the going and getting the latest version from a CMS to or some other system, some file system or whatever, and putting it on your local system where it needs to be with the correct names and all of that, so that you can very easily overwrite that content goes here placeholder with the actual placeholder and keep it up to date. But in the earlier example of the highly interactive stuff, those things changed. Those artifacts changed over time, right? In other words, we had versions. So the version of that artifact went along with that version of that code. So I may change the code that define that artifact's behavior as well as the actual artifact itself, meaning the sprite or whatever, right? I would change them with the same commit, and they would be the same version. And if that version got out of sync, then the application would get out of sync. So they needed to get into source control, but these artifacts were hundreds of megs, and so it was really, really painful, and we never really came up with a good solution, quite frankly. We kept jumping the fence between, we check a placeholder into TFS or into source control that was just something that was good enough, right, that didn't look too horrible, and then also go and have a CMS or some file system or something with a build process that went and got the latest version. So it was still versioned. It wasn't tightly versioned to the code, source code version, right? So we had a CMS version and a source code version, and it was painful no matter how we cut it.
I think you hit on something key, because I started thinking about databases. Like what should be from a database be checked into source control? For me, it comes down to, do I need to get back to a point in time? Do I need to figure out, okay, today the site's going into QA or it's going into a beta format, it's all stable, everything's good, but over time there are going to be bug fixes and things, and we may introduce something and then we need to roll back to that same state. To me, in order to get that, you need the complete system, right? To the end user, the complete system is a working system. They don't really care you use source control. They just want to be able to get back quickly to that working system. So we started talking about database files or scripts. This is the one barrier even I've seen greater than developers is DBAs and stuff who just don't want to use source control. It baffles my mind. It's like, how could you not want to keep a history of your changes? Like,
do you ever want to get back to where you were right now?
Well, if we're
does it
talking
work
about
right now, and do you want to get back to that, right? If so, use source control.
If we're talking about SQL Server, though, is the support very good, honestly?
Well, no, but you could argue even out, you're talking about images and things. It's convenient that it gives it to you, but
right. I understand the idea that yes, our DBA is like, what's the matter with you that you're not committing like series of scripts to get back to where you were? But there's an interesting thing about the databases is one is I actually don't think our tools are all that great. Like, we certainly don't have the integration in SQL Server Management Studio that we have in Visual Studio. There are some Visual Studio SQL data tools, but I don't run into a lot of people that actually have either tried them or used them, especially the database developers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that's peculiar about databases is that they're both content and schema, and sometimes those things are tightly married. Now, you might argue that that's poor design, but it's not so much that you need to roll back the schema, it's that, well, I'm at this place in time, and how do you source control that? So I'm curious what your strategies have been, because I think that many organizations, quite frankly, just don't source control the
No,
database. You know how they source control the database? Go get a copy from prod. Go get a copy from QA. That's true. That, I mean, and especially when you hear me say, "What? Go get a copy from prod?" Come on, how many orgs have you been in where they just go get a copy from prod? And that could be very scary if it's important and sensitive information.
I usually ask for that at least once a week, because developers, it's almost impossible sometimes to troubleshoot things that happen in production without having some snapshot of that data. Yeah, again, this gets back to my original comment a little while ago. A lot of these things are human problems, not technical problems, right? The technology can store those files. I say it almost gets back to, I started thinking about not just database schemas, but what about like data itself, right? You have certain data you need to drive a system. Maybe it's the list of states or whatever you can think of. It could be even the entire configuration. We talked about CMS databases before. If you don't have that state in the right format or in the right pieces, all of a sudden your application doesn't work. And then you end up spending a lot of time churning, trying to figure out, okay, let me trace this. Okay, wait a minute. Oh, I've dealt cases with WordPress. Oh, that plugin was not enabled correctly, so that's why it's not working. Or whatever environment you work in. Even things as images and PDFs. People are like, I gave you the PDF, but it never got checked in, so all of a sudden now everyone's lost it, the file.
Right.
So this gets to one of the things that I ultimately think is one of my other big pet peeves, is I almost want, you talked before about, Chris, of getting a clean Git. I almost want, in some cases, to want to be able to delete the developer's machine at the end of the day. Because they're like, oh, I've done this work, it's all done, it all works. Okay, is it checked in? No. Oh, then it's not done. It's not done until it's built in source control and someone else can get it out and it works.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is the thing that is behind my my demand for checking in multiple times a day, is assume that your hard drive is going to fail at any moment, right? And how much time do you want to waste? How much of your effort that you've spent writing that code do you want to be wasted? And the answer is, you're going to be able to get back to the last time that you committed. So if that was 2 days ago, then you've now lost the past 2 days. If it was 10 minutes ago, then you've only lost 10 minutes, and it's pretty easy to recover, right? So just assume the worst, and then you can also get some benefits of, well, let me see where I was 2 hours ago. I mean, let me compare to it. You know, that actually worked a whole lot better than what I got myself into now. So let me just roll back, right? That might be a benefit sometimes. Let me actually just roll back to where I was 2 hours ago, because that was a better state, and start from there again. So yeah, I completely agree. But going back to the database versioning, I also agree that it's content and schema together. But the versioning needs for development, when you're developing with database, are different than the deployment needs. So you may go through multiple iterations of development. The developers' needs, as they're developing, as they're iterating over features, as they're enhancing the database schema, they're adding new features that need changes to the schema, and they're frankly playing around with things, right? Trying to figure out what actually needs to go into production. All that really matters is what happens at the end. And I guess that could be said for any code, right? All that matters is the end result. But for database schema and content, it is kind of so difficult to manage that I've found it a whole lot easier to just say, we're just going to let things go for now, and developers, you can check in the schema, the SQL schema, every once in a while, but it's not like we're ever going to go back and run that again, right? It's more of a reference point of how did it look like at this point in time. And then what really matters is, once we're stable, once we're good, and we're going to deploy this code to production, then we go and take a copy of the production database, or just do a diff and see what is the difference in both content and schema. So if you really do have content differences, go ahead and look at the content and compare those two, but certainly the schema. And then that is the thing that you want to check in and tag in source control, so you can see kind of the history of your schema changes that actually went into production, because the development that you went through to get there is almost irrelevant at that point. And in that regard, I feel like the migrations, Entity Framework code migrations, maybe not the actual API or the framework, but the very least the concept that they apply, where you are using code to kind of define schema changes, and you're checking in that code that defines those schema changes. Those definitely go in the right direction, because they kind of allow you to play back those changes. So start with a certain version and then execute code that adds a column, modifies a column, drops a column, blah, 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 blah. But I see that as a lot as for development, right? And so when you actually go to deploy those changes, that's when you go and do a SQL compare, a schema compare, and a data compare, and then figure out what to do from there, and come up with that one script that you run for that one deployment.
Yeah. I think, too, some of it to do with the fact that with databases, it's very easy to back up a database or restore a database. So in most cases, an easier way to do it.
You're not going to want to do that in production, though.
No. But I
mean, the step zero of every database deployment to production I've ever done is back up the database, which I'm not saying that's bad. Of course, you want to do that. But then, the plan is always, well, if things go really wrong, then we're going to roll back. Have you ever rolled back a database deployment?
I have.
How many times have you done it?
Twice.
Twice. In how many deployments?
Oh, probably hundreds.
Yeah, right. And why did you choose to do it in those two deployments?
One case, it was a CMS system, and the CMS was having issues in the database. It was a shared CMS system, so one site was actually taken down another site, so we had to deploy back the older version. That was like a day or two old kind of deal. The other one I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was some case where it was a very data-driven system, so the configuration data was incorrect. So instead of trying to figure out what was wrong, they just restored back. In that case, it wasn't the right solution, but it was what worked for them at the time.
Well, did you try to deploy those same changes again, or did you go back to the drawing board?
In this case, they didn't have them. So the developer never saved off the changes. And instead of they didn't have, I don't know, I don't remember all the details, but it was a case where if they had actually did the diff script and checked that in to source control, they would have been able quicker to do it. They could have did the restore and run the script. But they created the script and then threw it away.
Yeah. So it was a people problem.
Yes, it usually is a people problem.
Yeah. So I mean, databases are part of our systems, and so we have no problem committing our code to source control. That's a piece of cake, and we'll just save our C# code to keep it simple. Do us Visual Studio developers not have the right tools? I get the feeling, Jess, that there are some tools that might not be in the box that you're using when you're saying, oh, I do a schema compare, a data compare. Really? Is that in the box? Is that in the Visual Studio box?
Yes.
Not tools I've used.
I don't know what the versions needed are, because I'm usually on Ultimate or something like that. But there are, especially in 2015, there are SQL compare tools in the box in 2015.
Did not know that. I've always used a third-party type of tool.
That's interesting. We don't know that, right?
Yeah.
There are some good ones, right? Like the Redgate folks make a good one. But,
yeah, that's the one I've used.
But to know that hey, this might be sitting here in the SQL data tools in the box, and we're not using it, like what a huge mistake, right? What a huge mistake. And
there's actually a whole project type. There's a SQL project type that gives you kind of first-class support for store procedures, tables, column, all the table definitions, the whole the data.
Had that for a while,
definition. Yeah, no, that's been in there for a while.
Projects for a long time. I think since 2005. Visual Studio 5 had them. But I didn't know how to compare
these new tools with the schema compare and everything actually integrate very well with that project. So you can kind of create these diffs and these deployment scripts and things like that with that tool.
So do you think, and just one last point on databases and source control, because they're kind of a bane, I think, is do you think that the de-emphasis, I'd say over the last 10 years, of using stored procedures and other database constructs like triggers and functions, everything that you would have to get loaded into your database, and instead kind of a move towards code-based like ORMs that are super easy to check in, does that have anything to do in your mind with source control, source controllability?
Are Are you trying to start a religious debate here?
I
No,
was
I'm
gonna
just
say,
curious. I'm
where
curious
you
because
at?
10 years ago, that was what you did. You
It-
used the
Most
tools of
places
the
still do.
database because they were fast. And they are fast, right? I mean, if you use the SQL Server has all these wonderful features that we have thrown off the deck. And if it has to do with source control, I'm just curious, was that even like a partial motivator?
I don't think so. I think the convenience factor, or the who's doing the work factor, because I consult to a variety of different customers, and I have to honestly say I think 80 to 90% of them still use stored procs, at
Okay.
least for reading, um, and that's simply because that's the standard they have.
Right.
I know the couple places we have Oracle, it's like you can't get away from that.
Sure. I think that's probably very true.
Yeah. And the other places where we were able to push Entity Framework completely, it was simply about it was a smaller site that they didn't really have DBAs. Particularly if anybody has a database group or department, they really try to still push the database stuff.
Right.
And
An
I
interface to
found
the database. Yeah.
it's nothing really to do with source control. I know we kind of get on a tangent. It's to do with the idea that they think it's easier to deploy a store proc change. Oh, there's a
Right.
problem. I can easily deploy that change compared to deploying code, which has always driven me nuts because to me it's all code in the end of the day.
Right.
So,
So earlier we were talking about frequency of check-ins and frustration that somebody's not checking in enough, they're not keeping up, or maybe even I was curious, is it possible to be too quick about it? So in order to get the most out of that, in order to get the most out of developer being fearless about checking in and not screwing up the trunk for everyone else, we're going to have to talk about branches.
yes,
Does anyone want to take a stab for some folks who I actually think this is true? Many developers who they might know the feature is there, but they don't think about when to use it, how to use it, or even the value it brings to them.
Well,
with the
so
terminology
Todd
of
nailed it. Todd nailed it exactly earlier, right? So he mentioned stability, and so for me, that's all it comes down to is stability, right? So you don't want to. If everybody is developing, all developers are checking in source code to one single repository. The worst possible thing you can do is check in a breaking change because that breaks everybody, right? The next time they go and get the latest code, they're all broken with your change. And so what that really speaks to is an unstable project, right? You've introduced instability by committing a bug or something that just doesn't even build. So that is kind of the most blatant example. But it could be as subtle as this is a new feature you're working on, you're not really sure how it works, or you're not really sure, or it's a far-reaching kind of refactoring or something that may have effects on other areas of the system, and you haven't really committed to it yet. And so the risk of integrating with everybody else and messing everybody else is a little bit higher than the risk of losing all the work that you've done, right? And so you want to keep it separate, but you still want to use source control. And so for me, that's when branching comes into play. So branching, that's really one example of when you would want to use branching, but to extrapolate a little bit more and talk about it at a higher level, a branch to me is a way to kind of isolate that code so it doesn't affect other lines of development. And so you can use that in both ways. I just kind of describe a branch where it's a little more experimental, a little bit more unstable, and so you want to keep that unstable code, that emerging code away from the more stable code that everybody else is working on. But it can also go the other way, and I actually use it very frequently going the other way, where once everybody has checked in and the main development, the main line of development has gotten stable enough that it actually is more of a candidate for QA testing or production or whatever, I actually create a separate branch for that. So I'll have a QA branch, and so when that line of code is stable and ready for testing, merge it to another branch so that the testers can have that more stable branch. You're lessening the risk of testers getting bad code, whereas developers can keep going, right? And then my developer, my careless developer can go ahead and accidentally check in a breaking change to the development branch. It's not going to mess with the QA testers because they're on a completely different branch. So we've been talking about branches, and I think we've all now thrown out the word trunk. That the terminology here is more in like in tree terms, right? So you have the trunk, which is where all the
Botany.
magic happens. Yeah, that is the main thing, kind of the definitive thing. Whereas when you deviate from that, when you add code onto that, when you change code and deviate from that, it's called a branch because, as a tree and a branch kind of branches off, you've kind of taken that trunk code and you're adding some stuff to it, some extra stuff to it. In other words, you're taking the 80, 90, 99% of the code that is in that trunk that represents the full working system, and then you're changing the 1% or 5% or whatever to make it a little bit different. So that's called a branch, and every source control system that I've ever used has supported the ability to branch. Some of them did it very, very horribly. Some of them continue to do it very horribly.
Did
Others
Visual
do
Source Safe really do that?
yeah, it did it. It was called make a copy of a folder and link them and pretend
Yes.
that they're connected together. And then when you
Oh,
actually
goodness.
trying to bring them back together, in other words, merge, so that's the other kind
Yeah.
of terminology is merge, right? You've made a bunch of changes in a branch separate from something else, and now you want to bring them together and have those changes in that main line of code. That's a merge. And the worst possible thing in a merge is a conflict.
Yes.
Merge conflicts.
Well, we have to deal with them almost on a daily basis, or occasionally. So you mentioned that some tools do things better than others. I primarily use TFS, and have you guys come across other type of tools that maybe do that better, or maybe something some people should maybe not be familiar with, that may be of interest to them?
Well, before we get into tools, I'm wondering more of just kind of general kind of best practices and rules and approaches you guys have used with branches, regardless of the tool, right? Because branching and merging, and particularly merge conflicts, are an issue with any merge tool, regardless of the tool, right? So, do you guys have you guys worked with things in a certain way to avoid those issues?
Well, I hate merging. It's the bane of my existence. Every time I have to merge something and something doesn't merge right, I want to kick and scream and act like a 2-year-old. So my solution to that problem is check in early and often. Try to minimize the merging conflicts the best I can. Mostly cases, we talk about branches and trunks and things. Most of the places I've worked, it's basically there are 3 or 4. There's production, because everyone needs to have the ability to provide a hot fix to production at some point. There may be a QA branch, or there may be, and then in development there may be like sort of ongoing development, and then like you said, experimental development. You may have 3 or 4 branches. If you have a product, you may actually do that more around, all right, release 2015 is in this branch, release 2014 is in this branch, because in those cases you're not just dealing with one version of production, you're dealing with 3 or 4 potential different releases. Like if you think of Windows, right? When there's Windows 10, there's Windows 8. You'd almost suspect Microsoft would have a different branch for those. They wouldn't all be kind of in the same thing. In my experience, most people don't go beyond that. I've come cases where like someone will be like, I need to check. I want you to look at this code, but I want to check it into the main branch in TFS. And I'm like, well, shelve it. And they're like, shelve? What's that? So I think, other than the basic stuff, I think for most developers,
Yeah, what is it? Go ahead.
someone decides to take. Well, I'll talk about it in a second. Someone decides to create a branch, and the developer's just like, I'm just checking code in. I really don't care what branch I'm checking stuff in. Well, TFS terms, shelving is the idea of, I don't even know what the proper Microsoft terminology used, but I look at it as it's like semi-private branch. I have my little code changes. I've only checked those changes in, and now I can share them with you. And then you can look at MGS and say, oh, this is good. We can now merge it into the main branch, or there's some problem or some reason we don't want to check it into the main branch.
Yeah, so shelving, I describe shelving as, well, first of all, it's specific to TFS, at least the implementation.
I believe so, yeah.
But it's basically, it's effectively a temporary branch. It just makes it really easy to share code with somebody else without having to check it into that main line of development, which sounds exactly like what the description I just used to describe what a branch is. But this is without creating a full-fledged branch and all of that stuff. It's just you can take this shelf set and you can unshelve it against the main line of code, or really any line of code. Yeah. And so it is tied to a specific branch or a specific folder, but you don't check it in directly to there. So it exists in the source control system. Any individual developer can find it and kind of temporarily uncheck it uncheck it out or unshelve it to get those changes locally, but they're not affecting anyone else. So it's kind of if you're afraid of commitment, it's kind
There you
of
go.
a nice way to commit without actually committing.
Yeah. I also think too a lot of this is we've talked about this kind of very like high level description. A lot of places developers don't have access to create new branches. There's sort of like an admin team for your source control, or maybe the lead developer. They can create new branches. Other developers don't have that ability. So by using a shell set, you're getting the ability to have, like you said, a temporary branch where you can do some work in it and then commit to changes.
Yeah,
So I
right.
think it's almost it came about more of a problem than necessarily it's a solution to a problem that only really exists because of security and other things you may encounter.
Well, no, regardless, even if I could make a full-fledged branch, often I don't want to just because that's
Yeah.
overkill. It's far easier for me and for you, for me, the producer, the person who's checking things in, and for you, the reviewer or whomever, right, the one that I'm trying to collaborate with and show you my ideas. So it's a very easy way for both of us.
Well, generally
So,
speaking, the branch is forever, and
Yeah.
a shelf set is,
Temporary.
look, I don't need to put a name to it. Now, another use for it, do you guys ever use a shelf set to say, okay, the prototypical fire drill has begun. I need to put aside what I'm working on, but hey, I'm on a good pace here, but it's kind of broken. Like I've got another bug to squash. I've got a few more pieces of code to work out, but I don't want to throw this away. I can put it aside, get back to where the code is, do that
Mhm.
work, commit it, bring back my shelf set. Is that a use case?
Yeah, definitely one I've used.
TFS? Okay.
yeah, absolutely. I'd say that's actually how I use it the most, is not to share with other people, but to just kind of have a placeholder myself. And in that, I generally use it as because I tend to get a little carried away when I refactor. I go to refactor one class, and then I happen to be in another class, and so I just my knee-jerk reaction is to go and fix that one too, and I end up like
Yes.
fixing 10 classes where I really only wanted to fix the one class, and so I'll shelve all those other 9 changes and I'll just fix the one, right? And then I'll go back because I did the work, right?
Yeah.
I'll go back and unshelve them and try and get those changes back and see, maybe throw some away, maybe not, but basically not let that work go to waste, not have to do that work again. That's probably my top use for shelf sets.
Yeah. It's definitely a
But
feature
so.
people should take a look at and try to take advantage of.
Yeah, absolutely. So Todd, you started kind of talking about this. You started talking about releases and hot fixes and things like that. I've mentioned, branching off for an experimental feature or something like that. And Chris, you were actually just talking about, fire drills or something is going on in production and I need to go and get what's in production and be able to fix that, which is kind of like a hot fix. I think what we're all referring to are actually different kind of defined strategies for version control. So I actually found in the research for this, there's I've actually used this. I didn't just find it for this show, but I've used this. It's called the Version Control Guide. It's vsrbranchingguide.codeplex.com. I'll put the link in the code notes. But this is something, it is general to source control. So this is actually produced by the TFS ALM Rangers, they're called. So they're very much connected with the Microsoft community, the TFS community. But they define 4 strategies, four version control strategies. Release, so branch per release. So I think this is what you were talking about, Todd. And it also kind of describes this scenario I was talking about where I have a branch for QA, a branch for production, right? Those would be my releases. Or you might have a branch if you have a product and a V1 version of the product, a V11 version of the project. Those might be different branches. The second one is maintenance branches or hotfix branches. So if you have a hotfix, like say to a release, so you can actually branch off a release branch, right? And so you have a branch off a branch. You have a twig now off of the branch. Right, and that's to make kind of more small targeted fixes. And then the third one is feature branches. So those are kind of the things that I described earlier, that where you're branching off to have like experimental features, you're fooling around or whatever. So it's kind of the opposite of a release branch. It's not more stable than the main development branch. It's actually less stable or more experimental. And then finally, you have the fourth one is team, a team branch, a branch per team. And that is just like it sounds, like the three of us are on a team, and we'll have our own branch of the main code base, and another 4 developers on another team may have their own branch, and so it's just like we can collaborate together, and we're checking in, but we're checking in and we're isolating ourselves from other teams' changes, and vice versa, right? We're not letting our changes affect other teams. So that tends to work really well when the 3 or 4 of us are working on a certain feature set, and another team is working on another feature set, and not necessarily the same files. They also define one more. The first one they define is no branch. That's a valid branching strategy too, where everybody just checks into the main branch, and you don't branch off.
More common than you think.
Yeah, well,
that's called normal.
There's something to be said to, and I'm calling these 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I'm just kind of that's the numbering they gave them, and these are I've definitely seen other strategies documented and being used out in the wild. This isn't like the be all end all list. This is just a very good guide where they really walk you through like what are the pros and cons of each of these things, right? But I mean, to your point, Chris, that's it is widely used, right? The no branching strategy, but what that does is that avoids merge conflicts, because branching is painful, but it's not the branching, it's the merging back. It's the changes that get made on the different branches, and when you have to reintegrate everything back together, and then you've made a change to one line in one file, and I've made a change to the same line, who wins? Those.
But I've seen that on the trunk though. I've seen merge hell on the trunk where and now look, merge hell on the trunk is kind of symptomatic of a larger problem, I think, and one that maybe we don't want to confront. But you'll go to work on something, and then other developers are working, and you're in the same files, and they go ahead and they commit, and they do something that's very, very valid, but then you need to work, and you're like, oh, great, a conflict. Really, it's starting to tell you something when you have a lot of merge conflict hell on the trunk. It's kind of telling you that you maybe haven't really separated the concerns in your code, because if you've got a small team of just like maybe even just 4 or 5 people, and you're kind of not really branching that much, and yet you're still finding yourself with a lot of merge conflicts in code. I want to make it clear I'm not talking about CS proj files, because those things are hell when you're just doing something stupid like adding a new file to your project, but just in code, and it's like asymptomatic. It's like telling you, hey, you're having problems because you've stuffed everything in one file, like a God file, or maybe maybe they're all God files. Like, I mean, heck, I've been in that project too, where you've got a ton of code in a ton of files, and they're all just God files and classes that are just doing everything.
Yeah, it can also indicate that your team's not communicating well enough too, right? Yeah. Like, if you and I are working on the same line and the same file often, why are we doing that, right? Why are we making changes to the same component on the same day?
We probably should talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Either we're both trying to do the same thing, which is horrible, or I'll work on it today and you work on it next time. Like, let's not try and change the behavior of the same component at the same time. That just doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah, I think in the web time, I see a lot of that with the same page. So there are ways around that, like Chris said, separating concerns and things like that. I think that's where a good tech lead and someone who understands, really has source control, works, and how collaboration can work easily. It's about just separating the work out better so that you don't have what you just said. Why are people making changes? They shouldn't be. Each person should be isolated from themselves the best they can. But there are certain cases where I think of CSS files. It's really hard to separate those out, right? You might be working on one page and making your changes, and I'm working on another one making my changes. Just because it's easier to have one CSS file, in most cases, you have conflicts, and it's something you have to deal with. We'll never not have conflicts. Again, I think it gets back to just what you and I said originally. If you are checking in on a pretty good cadence, again, you're always checking in working code, that effort to do the merge, to me, minimizes itself. Because I made a change, you didn't go off and make your change, we're not waiting 3 weeks later and go, oh, I've made 100 file changes, now I have to figure out what's going on.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. That is my number one strategy, pretty much my only strategy for avoiding merge conflicts, is just to integrate as much as possible. Even if we're not talking about a branch, right? Like, so Chris, you were just talking about conflicts on trunk, right? If we just have one branch or no branches, right? Everybody's committing to the same thing, and we're still having conflicts. That's, to me, that means that. So I'm very pessimistic about this, right? I consider every single change to the code as an opportunity for conflict. Call me pessimistic, but that's what it is, right? So often it doesn't turn into a conflict because other people aren't changing the same line of code that I am, but the risk is always there. And so the way that you get around that is just get latest all the time. Right, so integrate all the time, but integrate goes two ways. So the first thing in integration is get the changes that everybody else has made onto your local machine. And if you're doing that on a regular basis, and by regular I mean like more than once an hour, very obviously depending on the check-in rate of your team, right? If you've got dozens of members, checking in every couple minutes or whatever, then you're going to want to do it probably every couple minutes. But don't wait for those 2 days when you finished your component or you finished your change, and now you say, okay, now I'm ready to check in, and now let me see what everybody else has been doing for the past 2 days. Don't wait that long. At the very least, even if you're not going to check your stuff in, just continually get latest. And I'm very anal about that, right? I'm very kind of OCD about that. I'm always getting latest whenever I think about it. I say, let's see what everybody else has had. And the more you do it, the fewer conflicts are going to happen in each individual one, and you can deal with them individually rather than seeing. They're more manageable, right? So that's what I was about to say. So rather than seeing 1,000 conflicts because they've gone through different changes over the past couple of days, and you have to kind of figure out the history of why these changes were made, now you've just got 2 of them, but you saw why that happened because it just happened. It was different than it was. That code is now different than it was 10 minutes ago. You see, it's a small change. Okay, right? I see what they were going for here. That's clearly the winner. Rather than having to go through 100 commits that have happened over the past 2 days and kind of figure out the timeline and who won and all of that stuff.
Or if you have cases where you have a lot of changes in one check-in, if you had to go back and look at that history, all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I was looking for this one thing, but these other 10 files have changed.
Yeah.
Did they introduce something else that caused other problems?
Yep.
So only because, just in case we don't bring it up, I think there's a few other pet peeves I have. It's kind of related to merging and checking things in. Now I kind of want to hear if you guys have anything similar. One is the first idea that for a long time we fell in love with this idea that we had to comment the current date and time and our name in the source control files.
Oh, God.
I still hate when I see that. I'm like, you can put comments in. That's a whole other discussion about when you put comments in. We do not need to put history.
That is my pet peeve too. That is my pet peeve too, or putting in your initials or something. Yes, I know it was you. I see it in the history. You're the one who checked it in. Every single source control attributes the author.
Yeah, there are still places. I couldn't think of one off the top of my head, but one that sort of came to mind as an example was, if there's something I'm doing that maybe is potentially going to break a lot of things, yeah, maybe it makes sense to say on this date I made this change, but that's just not keeping a log history. That's saying I made such a significant change, I want to make sure it's documented.
No, even then, it's not warranted, right? So what I just said, that all of that information is attributed on the commit itself. So the source control system has the date, the author, and the files that have changed, the lines of code that have changed. I think what you're getting to is why did that code change?
Yeah.
That is important. Yeah. And so go ahead and put that. If you want to put that in the comment literally in the source control, yeah, sure, go ahead and put that, right? But that thing doesn't change. And what I'm saying is it doesn't matter what day you did it. It doesn't matter who did it. It doesn't matter that you did it versus I did it. All that matters is why it was done, right? What was the thinking? And that's perfectly legitimate to put in a code comment. Yeah. But to put my initials and then the date timestamp offers absolutely no value. It's completely
or the copyright. It's like, that's kind of stuff that can be handled by a build. Yes. And that's the build process makes sense.
Yeah.
The other big one to me is, and I see it all the time, why do developers like to comment things out, check it in, which may be valid in some cases, but they never remove the dead code. It just drives me nuts.
Yeah,
it's
leaving
like
dead code
all the freaking time. They're like, I may need it again. I'm like, fine. You commented it out. You checked it in. Now it's in source control. You delete it. Sometimes I'll come across files, 3/4 of the file is commented out, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? You asked me for help, and you have 7 different solutions for the same problem.
Yeah, ask anybody that I've ever worked with. Commented out code is my #1 pet peeve above and beyond anything else. And it's so bad that I will, even if I'm just like looking through a file, if I see commented code, I delete it. I just delete it.
I I've gotten to that case too.
Because it doesn't belong there. My description for that is, if that code didn't work, like, why was it commented out? Why was it commented out in the first place? It was commented out because it didn't work. It didn't do what you wanted it to do. So why do you want to save code that doesn't work?
They're afraid to lose it.
Why are you afraid to lose code that doesn't work? It doesn't make sense.
I think some of your more experienced developers probably remember when you did just comment things out because you didn't have as mature of a source control system that we have now. But generally, I completely agree with you. Like, if it's not functioning, you should take it out. So, that means what we're kind of coming into are, letting source control be your guide to not commenting as much because you can do it in the source control, not commenting out dead code because you can do it in the source control. So, Jess, you were just saying that you'll go ahead and go through and rip out unused code that's in a comment. Do you isolate that in its own commit? Do you basically say, okay, a commit either adds value to the code, or because it's adding a feature? Boy, I want to make sure I make that distinction. Or it's adding value to the code because I'm getting rid of this dead code. Do you think it's important to split those into separate commits, or do you go like, nah, I'm in the middle of working. I came across this dead code that's in a comment. I'm going to go ahead and throw it out as part of my larger commit.
Yeah, that is a great point. And honestly, I'm not even going to answer your question. I'm just going to take it to a broader level, because what you're really talking about is what should the content of your commits be, right? How are you kind of organizing, how you're kind of combining them, how you're relating to them? In other words, you're talking specifically about commented out code. Do you want to isolate that commented out code and not combine it with this
well, maybe misleading that as part of doing this feature work, you commented out, you got rid of, you cleaned up the code. You went and did the housework.
Right.
But then you added an important feature, and you kind of don't want to confuse that in the long
run. Right. In other words, you
like,
had 50 lines of changed code, and one of them
60 files changed.
Right, but one of them was significantly changing the functionality of the system, and the other 49 were just comments. Right, you want to kind of change those out into separate commits. Yeah, you definitely want to think about that. Now, what do I do versus what do I think should be done? I think those are kind of two different things, because I already
right. It's okay.
I already kind of admitted that.
That's kind of like a rage commit, right? And I think that's right up your alley.
Honestly, rage committing, I've done those
before. Is that you just look at it and you're like, what is this doing in here? And it's just like rage commit. Boom! It is in. I know that it has absolutely nothing to do with the change I'm working on. It might not even be in the same module or the same project, or the same universe, but it's going in.
I made that comment earlier when we were talking about shelving, and that is actually when I will do shelving, I will come across something. I'll come across 50 lines of code that are commented out. I will shelve all of my changes, delete the 50 lines of code, check it in, and then unshelve and continue on. That is when I use shelving the most.
So what do you guys think about the commit that inevitably comes up in the tree where somebody on one or more files has clearly, and this is Visual Studio, gone and hit Control-K, Control-D, reformat code, and so the only thing that's changed is you just see every line of code is lighting up red, right? Every single line of code, but it's white space here, white space there, and then to top it all off, the significant change is buried in there somewhere. What do you think about that?
That's the problem. Is what you just said. So you just kind of keep restating the same problem over and over again.
They are the same problem.
Yeah, you're burying really important lines of code with all this other fluff. But I mean, first of all, any good diff tool should be able to isolate the white space, right? Basically, just ignore all the white space changes. So when you're looking at a diff of that code, any good diff tool should say, here's the change, right? In other words, that really functional change, the important change that actually happened. But those things are along the same lines as deleting commented code, right? Reformatting code, making it look good. Those are important. They're completely non-functional, but in order to keep your code base up, you want to have things spaced out properly and things like that. It's all important. And so I encourage those kinds of commits, but separate them. So delete the code comments, reformat, change white space all you want, but do it in a separate commit other than non-functional stuff. And in the comment for that commit, literally say, I'm changing the formatting, I'm changing the white space or whatever. In other words, don't look at me, don't look at this format.
Yeah.
So one I have, and I make the mistake all the time. I just made it the other day, and it happens in the web more. Is in the web sometimes it's easy to throw a debug statement in. Then you go through and make all your changes, and all of a sudden you check it in. You're like, oh shit, I left a debug statement in. So now like I have to go check it out to remove the debug statement. I know, Jess, you and I a long time ago talked about building some kind of gamification into TFS. Sometimes I almost want to have that like, oh shit thing. Just remove the file, but I don't need to check in. I don't need the history. I just need to freaking remove the debug statement.
Yeah,
or
I've done
even
that.
just
I have a
secrets
project.
accidentally end up in the code.
Huh?
Or what about the case where like secrets accidentally end up getting checked in because you know for this one case maybe you put a password in a place because I mean I don't know the web config or a credentials in there or a shared secret for your cloud service. So now you've got this other management issue. Keep it out of your source control. At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
And sometimes our frameworks didn't help us too much there. And I will say that I think the ASP.NET 5 team is like they are looking at that, right?
Yeah.
But when we were used to saying like, well, where am I going to store this stuff? And it's a really convenient place to put it in the web config. Well, now it's going in your source control, and is that securely locked down? Is it the right place? And I never thought it was.
Then you get into a whole other thing, which is one thing we haven't touched on is what if you have things where it's in a web config file or some other kind of configuration that is environment dependent? Where do you store those? Where do you store the production database string versus development database string? And how do you prevent developers from checking in the wrong version? I've seen that many times. I've done it myself. You have to change your local database connection string to QA or whatever to test something, and then in a rush, you check it in, and all of a sudden everybody's hitting QA or production.
I think that's a whole
source control doesn't solve that problem. That's a big problem. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Proper configuration definitely is like a whole show, right?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely agree. We're talking in the context that we're talking about it here. It does make sense in terms of source control. But I mean, proper configuration. The answers that I want to give to your question have nothing to do with source control. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah, definitely.
Which I think is really the kind of sum it up in the beginning. Source control is about collaboration, right? We need source control to collaborate. If you were only developer, would you need source control? I'd argue you would still need source control because you want the history and the other things.
Yep.
At some point, you may have other people looking at stuff for you. But it's the idea that it's not source control is not a silver bullet. It's not because I have source control, everything's better. It's just a tool in a bigger process.
Absolutely.
How do we do with deployment? How do we do with code reviews and collaboration and other things? It's a key integrated part. In many ways, it's sort of the heart of everything. But just having TFS or Git or whatever doesn't magically fix your problem. You still have to figure out the human side and figure out how to make it work with your environment and your organization.
Yeah, right. That's an important point. It definitely is part of the larger ALM process, the application lifecycle management process, especially with deployment. I mean, it generally tends to lead right into deployment, right? So the next thing you do after you check in is you want to see those checked-in changes actually reflected somewhere. And so the next logical step is for some system to take those changes, compile them, do whatever build is necessary, and actually update some working server somewhere, right? So you can literally see, here's my changes running in action, right? Here's my real live changes. It's the living version of the code. And that's actually one of the things that I've always done. I mentioned earlier I'll have a branch for development, a branch for QA, a branch for production, and part of the reason I do that is so I can actually use those source control branches for deployment, for automatic deployment. So I can attach a continuous integration build on top of each of those branches that looks for changes, and whenever anything is checked into those branches, those corresponding builds kick off for that environment. Build that thing, do whatever configuration is necessary, grab the configuration from some system or whatever, do all that build stuff, and then actually deploy to that environment. And so I use it as source control to isolate risk, isolate changes, use it as a way to promote changes. So I work in development, and once that gets stable enough that it's ready to go to QA, I promote it to QA, which kicks off a build which updates the QA system. So in order for the QA developers or the QA testers to start testing it, all I have to do is check in to that branch. And they're all very tightly related, right? Because they are a branch off of a branch. And then once the QA testers sign off on a specific version going back to the version of the source control that was built from, then I can go and I can promote that version to the production branch, which I've never actually gone all the way of continuous deployment to production. I've always been very afraid to do that, but conceptually, that I do everything but actually push it out into production, make an install or whatever, right? I do still have the manual process into place, but that's just because I don't really trust it. Technically, I could get it all the way to production.
And there's in some cases there are better tools to sort of handle that, especially like a server farm and things.
Yeah, sure.
But you could always integrate those into that process, which I ultimately think is, at the end of the day, to really take advantage of source control, you have to have a good process, and you have to follow it. You have to have a team that follows it. It can't be everybody just checking whatever the hell they want to check in when they want to do it. There has to be some level of human agreement ahead of time.
Yeah,
good teamwork ethic.
Yeah. So I've got a question for you guys. Do you guys have a story? Any good stories about when source control either saved you from a disaster or caused a disaster? Any good source control stories? What's your favorite source control story?
Well, the bug thing is something I mentioned because I had to do it all the freaking time. I guess when the thing about stories, it's more about developers not checking things in. Or I've ran the cases where, in this case, we were using, I think it's Visual Source Vault. That was what me and the client have agreed to use. But one of their developers, he decided to use something entirely different. So he kept saying, like, oh, this code is done, it's done and done. And I'm like, great. Is it in there? No, it's in my source control. And we're like, well, can you check it in? He goes, it is checked in, but we can't use it because it's not in our source control branch.
That's just insane.
Oh, yeah, it didn't last very long. We're like, we can't work with you. This is not going to work. I think he almost did it on purpose so that they would get rid of us because it was just, he wouldn't check his stuff in. It was very weird. Goodness. I had another case recently where we had source control and we were collaborating locally. This happens a lot in my environment in consulting. And then we had a shared source control in the cloud we shared with the customer. And so we were syncing things and all that was working. But their developer wasn't syncing things. So we actually had to go help them do some stuff on the server. And we got stuff down. And we were making some changes on the server. And for some reason, their developer deleted the changes we made. These are configuration files and some other things we had to need, certificates and some other things. And then backed up the backup my one developer had. He then found another backup and deleted that. Unfortunately, we had source control. We were like, oh, we could just restore it. But we were baffled why he deleted the backup and then the backup of the backup. He's just like, what the hell's going on? So, for me, the horror story is more about just using it properly. And then the other thing I can think of is really checking in, like I said, the debug statement or the configuration file, like Chris talked about, the database production thing. And I think the other, on the flip side, we've all lost code, right? Or we made Jess, you talked about it before, we've made so many changes that they may be right, but we need to get back to that old state, and we're like, damn, we can't get back to the old state, so we just have to roll back.
Yeah, well, that happens to me probably a couple times a week, just because I get just so crazy. I just can't contain myself, and I know it. And the way that I guard against it is whenever I get to a good state that I haven't gone crazy, I check in, right? And then I let myself go crazy and then roll back. And the worst that happens is I lose the, hour or two of code that I've been writing, but it's not a complete loss, because what that did was that allowed me to think through the problem. And basically, I'm using the code as just kind of a scratch pad, right? I'm just throwing code out there. I literally don't even care if it works or not. I'm just trying to figure out how to solve a problem. Once I figure it out, go roll back to that stable place and then write it again. But this time, write it the correct way. Write it well.
Experiment. Right? It makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, the one time that the source control really bit me was really with TFS, and it was an earlier version of TFS.
I've heard this story.
Fundamentally, TFS it thinks that it knows what you have on the client on the server. So on the server, it thinks that it knows what you have on the client, and it relies on read-only files. And now, granted, there was definitely, I was partially at fault here because I went and probably unset some read-only flags and screwed up. But whatever happened, the TFS got confused. So it didn't know what I had on the client, what it thought I had and what I actually had were two very different things, and I said something like "get latest" or whatever, and it said, "All right, sure, I'm going to overwrite all of this
All
stuff
your
that you
changes.
just did." Yeah. And so then I just got the version that was on the server. My changes were completely all gone because TFS just overwrote it, and I couldn't say anything about it. Now, I mean, it's come a long way, and I doubt that would happen today. And like I said, it's partially my fault, but that happened to me.
I
But
have a
the
similar horror story.
the other kind of issue that I've had, or the story that I've had, is not even like a single story. It's actually happened multiple times, and we have a big demo tomorrow, or the big client's coming in, or we have not necessarily a big release, but it's generally more of an internal thing. So nobody check anything in.
Oh,
Nobody. You might as well just be saying, everybody go home, right? What do developers do if they're not checking stuff in for like multiple
branches?
Exactly, right? So this has always come at a place where they're basically just afraid to make branches, right? And so the solution there is incredibly easy. Make a branch. Even if you don't want to make branches, right? Even if you're in that zero branch, no branch strategy camp, in this case,
great one.
Go ahead and make a branch, right?
You delete it, done.
Delete it after this big demo is done. But for me, branches are all about separating that risk, isolating that risk, and that's exactly what that situation is about, right? You can't check anything in because you might run the risk of breaking this demo. Okay, so check it in somewhere else. Still check it in. Don't stop checking it in.
Yeah. So real quick, my horror story, and I'm pretty sure I haven't tried this for the recent version of TFS. I had a case where I checked out some files locally, but then I was working on a VM, and I checked out files there, and TFS was totally confused. Basically, my workspaces got intermixed, and I checked in files, and it's like, you've already checked these files in. I'm like, no, I didn't. It's like, no, but you've checked all these files in. You don't have anything checked out. And I'm like, yeah, I do. So definitely, yeah. I mean, we could probably sit here and talk about lots of examples of mistakes. But to me, that's the reason why we have source control, right? We're going to make mistakes. If we have source control, it's very easy for us to go, oh, wait, I know I have a good stable version in source control. Let me roll back and deal with that. As opposed to, if we didn't have source control, we'd have files everywhere and be like, I don't know what goes with what.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I'll tell you, that's the one thing that, so if we start talking about specific systems, is being able to roll back, I think, is very important. And that's not always the easiest thing to do in Subversion. And I only bring that up because I think in the Microsoft world, developers, a lot of them are on TFS, I think. And then I think a lot of them are on Subversion because it's kind of the choice between, like, well, did we go with the free tool, or did we go with, did we get like MSDN Enterprise licensing and so we're going to use TFS because we paid
for it.
We paid for it anyway. And so I actually have found one of my biggest frustrations is when the tool doesn't help you when you've made a mistake and you say, okay, look, that clearly shouldn't have happened. It actually just happened to me the other day. And some of this had to do with the integrated Visual Studio. Basically what was happening is there was a project that I didn't control. I didn't want to make any changes to it whatsoever, but yet Visual Studio surreptitiously modified the CS proj. I didn't want it to. I didn't ask it to. Just on loading it, it modified the CS proj. And so when I went to commit, I'm looking up and down. I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, those are the files I changed. It doesn't even. And so this commit to this project happened, right? It was harmless, but it was also pointless. Like I didn't need that to change. And rolling back that change it's so not worth it. So what do you end up doing? You check in over top of it to get back to where you were, and that didn't make me happy. I wasn't happy about that at all.
Yeah. So the one thing that I wanted to talk about is centralized versus distributed source control. So there's two flavors of source control, and so far, I mean, we've referred to TFS, and you just referred to Subversion, and so we've referred to a couple of different source control systems, but so far, nothing that we've talked about has really implicitly or even really explicitly talked about, like, leaned a certain way versus to centralized or distributed source control. So I mean, Chris, do you want to kind of explain what centralized and distributed source control are?
Yeah, so I think in the last maybe 5 years, we've seen a rise of distributed source control systems I'll name two of them. I mean, Git is one, Mercurial is another. For a short time, it seemed like there was a battle between the two, and it was definitely like a Windows versus Linux battle. But I think even on the Windows side, Git is really moving ahead full steam. I mean, my evidence is pretty straightforward. Visual Studio 2015 has a GitHub for Windows extension in the box. So
And
you've
TFS supports Git too.
well, TFS now
2015
supports making Git
supports
repositories, and then of course, GitHub, the rise of GitHub. Microsoft has decided that our projects are going over to GitHub. We're going where the developers live. Now, just let's forgetting GitHub, forgetting Git, to just be getting a little bit academic about it. A centralized source control system is one where you have, a master server essentially, and all of us get our code from there, and we push our code to it, and our code isn't committed until it's pushed to that server. And now this could be a logical thing, but the point is it's a golden master. Somebody's in charge, and if Jess checks in his change ahead of mine and I have a conflict, well, Jess has already won the game. It's all over. I'm coming in after the fact, and I'm probably the one going to endure the pain of figuring out, okay, how do I get my commit to work with what he merged, or how do I obliterate what he did, or whatever, in order to make the system happy. So distributed, if we think about the way Git was implemented, and this is different from how it is being popularly used. That's very important, and we'll probably do a whole show on that. But the way Git was implemented is that I actually would have a Git source control server on my machine. I would open a port, and there was a standard port for it. I don't remember what it was. And it was essentially like a little web server. And, I would be working on a code base. I might be the originator of the code base, and I say to Jess, I want you to help me work on this code base. So he would probably go install Git and a little Git server, and he would pull my latest code base and he'd work on it for a little bit, and he would commit on his own separately on his own machine. These commits would be happening on his hard drive. They'd be nowhere else in the world. But then at some point you would probably tell me, Jess, hey, I've got a little bit of work I want to share with you. So I would pull from you, and I would pull those and add those commits to my source control. I've maybe even done a little bit more work since then, so they're getting piled on top. The point is that which one is in charge? Which one is the master? Now, we might have an informal agreement that, hey, Chris, you're in charge of the project, so look, you do the releases, you do the distribution, and now multiply this conversation, like me and Jess, add Todd, add 5 more developers. But the reality is they're all complete source control trees on our local hard drive, and they might be diverging and converging in various ways. 2 of us might go off and create a branch and start working totally separately, and then at some point say to the rest of the team, listen, over at Todd's repository, I think there's a good thing over there. Why don't you pull it, and let's think about adding it to our official release. Now, that's truly embracing like the social distributed aspect. And then I'm going to make the argument that most of us think of Git when we think of distributed source control, and I don't think that's how people use Git. I don't. I think people use Git with GitHub, which blurs the line again back to distributed and centralized. But it doesn't go so far as to put you totally back into centralized land, but it does start to say that repository is the one that counts. And as evidence, let's think about the ASP.NET project. There is a repository that counts for ASP.NET, and it's Microsoft's account. ASP.NET is the repository. That's the one that matters. It doesn't matter.
It's the golden master.
It's the golden master.
It's the centralized repository.
It is. It's just that there are features in GitHub and Git that enable like the social work, the isolation, and more importantly, the ability for me to like isolate my work without bothering that team. Not only do they not know that I'm helping them, they don't see any messy branches getting added to their system, and actually never will, even if I contribute back to them. So it kind of keeps them clean and it keeps it separate. But I would kind of make the argument from a practical matter that while there was this whole movement, I mean, when Linus created Git, he really wanted the ability to work offline. He really wanted that local source control system, and he wanted collaboration by pushing to other trusted systems. That's not how we're using it. And I think there is there's a whole conversation there about what's really happened with Git and quote unquote decentralized source control, which I would actually say is really a different thing that is more called social coding. Systems that make it even easier for us to collaborate than they did before, don't require any single golden master system to be up, and we can just keep working in isolation.
Yeah, and you mentioned you just kept giving examples of pulling from each other. So I pull from you, and you pull from someone else, but you can also, even in the way that that Git and other distributed systems were initially designed, you can also push to each other as well.
Right. I would pick people that I trusted to say
right.
And this was Linus's example when he talked about Linux. I have my group of trusted, kernel folks who kind of have their own teams of people that they trust, and so now. In fact, he's got a very famous video where he talks to Google about why he invented Git, and he says, now I don't have to trust the whole world of Linux developers. I just trust this little inner circle. I let them push to me. And then they've got to decide who they trust and who they let push to them.
Yeah,
and that was his impetus for creating it. Like that was why he really thought he needed that in order to manage such a huge open source project.
Well, so Linus didn't create distributed source control. There were distributed source
Git.
Control systems. Yeah, he created Git, but there were distributed source control systems before that.
Sure, I just think that Git and Mercurial brought it to the forefront of us corporate developers.
Mainstream, brought it to the mainstream.
Just like obviously object-oriented programming has a long storied history and so on. Eventually, something comes along that sits it down in front of us, the folks who are going to work Monday to Friday just trying to get something done. Mm-hmm. And I think probably it was, my opinion, I don't know, was Git and Mercurial were the first time that, hey, this is getting planted in front of the everyday developer.
Yeah.
So a couple quick comments. One is, in many ways, it sounds like, and like you said, Chris, a lot of people aren't fully taking advantage of this. Gets back to what we said, that people are used to working one way. Even though the tool allows you to do it, they kind of fall back to their old habits. But in many ways, it sounds like you're talking about like push-pull. The idea that every time I check into TFS, I'm pushing all my changes for the rest of the team to deal with, where it sounds more like when you deal with a distributed system like Git, I'm working in my environment, and maybe I do allow certain people to push and pull to me, but in most cases, I'm just publishing my stuff, and then someone else has to pull it in to the central repository. Am I kind of following that right?
Well, I think in a true like Git distributed system, the three of us are working on a project. It might be that at some point you say to me, hey, I fixed this certain problem. I think you should take a look at it, so I'll pull from you. I think, though, that the reason why folks gravitated towards using a centralized service like a GitHub, or even if it's not an online service, you install something on your own, like a product like Atlassian Stash or GitLab or something that essentially does the same thing, is more about friction. And you always hear me talking about this, is that there's a little bit of friction involved in the three of us saying we're going to embrace Git the way Linus intended. That means we got to set up a Git server, open a firewall port, and I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's enough.
Enough. No.
Whereas GitHub, how do we start using GitHub? We open up our IDE, since they all practically have integrated support now. We put in a link to our GitHub user account, and then we just push up there, and a new repository is created. And there's none of this, oh wait, I got to go open the special port on the firewall and get it port forwarded to my development machine. That just little tiny bit of friction is now gone, and that's, I think, the primary reason why it took off that way.
I would definitely agree with you. Yeah. In some ways, too, though, it seems like part of what decentralized give you is that freedom, where when centralized, we talked about before, is we want to use branches and things, but sometimes as a developer, I don't have the ability to create a branch. It sounds like when I'm decentralized, I'm more in my own little world.
Yep.
I have that freedom. So it's funny in a way that it sounds like this was basically created because the tooling we had at the time wasn't good enough, or was okay, but there were so many policies and other things put in place that prevented us from fully taking advantage of it. And like you said, there was friction, and now we're taking the tool, the better tool, the distributed tool, and now making it work more back in a centralized environment, we probably are losing something there.
Well, there are still some really good features. Like, for example, one of the things Linus said is he wanted the ability to work offline, like on an airplane. And sure, we can work on the airplane with Subversion or TFS, but you can't commit. You're just kind of stuck. And so with Git, you can actually commit. And yes, I know it's only going on your local hard drive, but now this really encourages the rapid committing. Because why not? You're not bothering anyone else. Just bam, 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 bam. Now, then you might say to me, okay, well, yeah, but now you just turned this little bit of work you did on the airplane into 24 commits. I don't really want that in the history. Well, Git allows you to kind of, quite frankly, manipulate the history however you want. You can take, and I know that sounds crazy. The first time you hear that, and because this is how I felt, the first time you hear that, you say, what? But what it really means is you can squash commits and say, well, I don't need the rest of the world to see the work I did on the airplane represented as 24 commits. I want to take them and make it one logical commit. This is the work I did. So you squash it down and you write a new comment, a new commit message saying, here's the work I got done, and that's what I will push to you, Todd, or I will ask you to take. And so from your perspective, you're not seeing the little commit in there where I said, boy, I really effed up here. Or the next commit.
Debug statement.
I forgot to take out the debug statement. Or, those messages are gone, and you kind of get to say, okay, well, this whole bevy of changes, which I've now squashed to one, so you're only going to ever know there was one, here was the logical result of that operation. And that's just one feature that I think you can use even if you go with GitHub and you go with, like you said, going back to a more centralized manner, that you kind of get a little benefit there just because of the foresight of the system. It really that has nothing to do with being decentralized. It's just kind of a neat feature. It almost makes me wish Subversion had it.
Yeah, I haven't really used Subversion too much, but I actually have a customer recently. It's what they use, and I'm like, oh, it's been like 10 or 15 years since I used Subversion. Wonder if it changed.
Yeah.
I remember it being quite painful at the time.
I think a big differentiator between the centralized and distributed source control is the fact that with the distributed source control, you have a full copy of the history. You have the full source control.
Yep.
Versus with centralized source control, you just have a snapshot of the latest stuff, and you just keep updating that snapshot and basically replacing that snapshot with what's the latest. And you literally have no idea about the history of how that current snapshot got to be the way it was. There is a history somewhere. It's on the central server, but you don't know that on your local machine at any given time.
Right. And you almost always have to make a call back to your central server to look at the history, right?
Right, because that's the only place it lives.
In Subversion, you got to do show log, and I know in TFS you got to do history. So
source control.
Yeah, you guys got anything else?
We're at 90.
Oh yeah, we've gone tonight. Yeah. You guys got anything else? You want to wrap it up?
Well, what I think is interesting is that source control has kind of become the central aspect of a lot of what we do, and it's not for the original purpose. Like, what was the original purpose of source control? It was, I don't want to lose my files. I need them to be safe somewhere. And then we added another feature. I want to be able to work with Todd. So I want Todd to be able to commit some work, and I want to be able to commit some work separately. And then we've actually started using it for other things. Like, when I commit, I want some automated processes to happen. Like, I don't know, maybe just some static analysis. Or I want it to build the sucker. Or I want it to deploy. And even like you said, Jess, you're getting out to deploy it to development, to QA. There are plenty of organizations who have taken the step of saying a commit ripples all the way out to production. And it's become the central, artery of our development system, and we're hanging a lot of what we do off of it, from everything from developer productivity, I want to get the code down, hit F5 and go, to I want to commit, and it's out in the cloud for the rest of the world to see in 90 seconds.
Yeah, it's a single point of truth. That's how I look at it. It is the truth. If it's not checked in, it doesn't exist.
If it's not checked in, it doesn't exist.
Just text files.
Absolutely.
If it works in your machine, it isn't good enough.
All right. Well, I think that's a show.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right, well, thanks for spending time with us. We hope you got a lot of value out of listening to this discussion, and if you did, please let other people know by submitting a review on iTunes and letting your friends know, because it's word of mouth that's going to help us grow and keep this thing going. Also, please check out our website at staticvoidpodcast.com, where you can find all of our episodes and sign up on our mailing list to stay up to date with everything we do. If there's anything you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you just want to tell us how wrong we are about something we said, please leave a comment on the website, or feel free to send us an email to comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. Todd, Chris, thanks for the chat.
Yeah,
Yep.
awesome.
Catch everyone next time.
All of you out there, we will talk to you next time on the Static Void Podcast. Boop, 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 boop. All right,
I thought that
so
was really good.
You have
Yes.
a lot of editing to do.
I have a significant amount of editing to do. So, is there anything that comes off the top of your head as something you want to chop out, just right off the bat? I assume we want to keep. So the major outlier to me was the database discussion, but I'm not necessarily ready to chop that out. That was only 10 minutes, also.
Oh, okay. I was
Yeah.
going to say that it definitely. I mean, there was a tangent point to it. I did have that written down in the notes, as like when I was thinking about database source control and why do we suck at it.
You kind of brought it up a little bit about tools.
Yeah, so I got to wonder about tools and like, is that what really made Entity Framework go? And I don't know. I mean, some of that could go.
It was 10 minutes. It was almost 10 minutes. It was like 11 minutes. So
I think the last part is a good candidate only because we probably didn't explain. We explained it a little bit, but I think if people aren't familiar with these terms, it may have got lost.
the whole last part?
Yeah,
Is
I
that
was
right?
I think there is a salvageable, very basic introduction description of centralized versus. I think you nailed it. I think you nailed it, Chris, in like the first like thing that you did, and then we started talking about all kinds of other stuff. I think I kind of agree, Todd, but I think we can salvage at least the basic description.
Yeah, probably. But
well, the thing that concerns me a little bit is that I kind of thought the show kind of felt to me more like, hey, we're still staying with source control concepts. We're not getting into any of the newfangled tools. And then maybe there's like a whole nother show of saying, what do developers use? They use TFS, right? You guys have a ton of experience with TFS. And then, hey, I've managed to start moving to Git. So let's talk about what are the features it had. And instead of getting caught up in this idea of decentralized versus distributed, just saying, what are the features? Let's get into the nitty gritty. What makes you productive? What doesn't make you productive? Who cares about the classification?
It's such a major distinction that I think it's a disservice to have a show about source control without talking about centralized and distributed.
yeah,
I agree what you're saying. I agree what you're saying.
Part of why I shied away from it, though, was the thing I kept bringing up was that in the end, developers have forged a new path, I think. And yes, I even have some notes here that like Linus bitched about GitHub, saying that's my tool so much superior, right? My way is superior. But in the end, developers went for the less friction.
Yeah.
Because it is kind of a bitch and a half to be like, oh, I'm going to set up a Git server. Yeah, right, you are. I'm not going to. Like, yeah, I'm going to take the time to do that.
Unless it's in the box. Unless Visual Studio, I can say new project, it works.
Yeah. I've done that. I've actually done that. The way I've used Git, the way it was intended, where I actually had, somebody sitting next to me had something on their machine, and I didn't actually have to set up a server. We just did a file share. You could push to a file share.
Yeah, I guess that's probably
It's
true.
just a UNC
So,
path.
So
the
one
Git,
other thing we
the
could
Git folks
definitely
come beat me up anyway.
Yeah,
All right, I'm just going to cut it out.
yeah, we started talking about like horror stories of source control. Some of that could probably get cut out. That's probably only like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, but this stuff adds up. I mean,
Yeah.
we went an hour and 40 minutes, but
I mean, have we got any feedback on the length of things?
no, nothing yet.
Aaron
I'm
hasn't
not.
said anything?
Got any feedback on the
I'm not at all. No feedback at all. I'm not at all. We have, according to my statistics, let me look now. We have 40 listeners. We have
Ooh.
40 subscriptions.
Nice.
So that's not just me. I don't have 40. I don't have 40 machines.
Only 32
It's
of them.
just like refreshing over and over again. Let me look up. Let me see the latest from yesterday.
All right, so I'm gonna start seeing my file.
Oh yeah.
Export, right? Export audio?
Yeah. No, yeah, export as WAV. 54 total downloads.
That might just be me. I don't know.
25 unique. 33 total. I don't even know what that means, but we'll go with the 25. So I think it's safe to say we have 25 subscribers.
Nice.
Yeah. And only 2 of them are on Windows Phone.
One of those is Chris. I have not subscribed yet on Windows Phone.
Oh.
Someday we will have our way.
People just don't know how miserable they are.
Exactly.
Oh, what
They
is
drink too much Kool-Aid.
what is Pocket Casts? I'm wondering if any of these are like. Well, no, these are actually like downloads of the actual files. This is measuring this statistic. The way that I did it, if you go on the website right now, or even just look at the feed, you see that it's blueberry.com, media.blueberry.com / static void podcast / blah 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 blah, the file name, right? So it like redirects, and so it's measuring the file downloads, not like anything else, not people who are subscribing to the RSS feed. It's actual file downloads. So anyway, so there's that. So I think my approach for editing this one is really to just go through and find the stuff that we want to say and chop that out and construct a show out of that. Rather than chopping stuff out to cut it down to a certain amount, build it up just on the things that I'm not sure how realistic that is, because that may or may not flow. But there were definitely several things that we kind of talked about more like out of order, that we could even reorder and it would still be fine. By the way, I still did it, but I tried to avoid saying things like, as you said earlier, or you said it before or whatever, like calling,
I did that a few times.
referring to points in time. No, I did it too. I try not to do it, but I did it. Or at least do it in such a way that you can cut it out later. But so that we could theoretically move things around, right? The stuff that we talk about at the end, we could put it in the beginning, and it isn't confusing when we say, as you said before. What are you talking about? The show just started.
So I have a question. How big are usually our files?
After
this one's
all compressed and everything. So I'm.
Oh, but I don't mean. I'm sorry. I didn't mean.
It's like 600 megs. This one's going to be big. This one's going to be probably 800 megs. So you guys save them as 16-bit PCM WAV files in stereo, and then what gets so like one of the first things I do, I want to have the full quality version, which is why I'm asking you to put it in stereo. But like the first thing that I do is convert it down to mono, because it's talking, so it doesn't matter. And so that literally just cuts it in half. Like that's literally just taking one track out, right? Combining the tracks and turning them into one track. So that cuts it in half. And so it turns 600 into 300. And then the final file size has been like 30 megs. The final MP3. Yeah, for an hour. It's like 30 megs an hour. So yeah, it's really
recording in stereo, in case you're wondering.
You are?
I haven't been.
Oh, you haven't been?
No.
Oh, I noticed that last time. You should.
I read some advice that you shouldn't on the podcast.
Record?
Yeah.
You should not record in stereo.
I'm just telling you, somebody who claimed to understand making podcasts was like, it doesn't matter because you're talking into one mic and it's not like you have a left and right channel. And look, I don't know anything about audio.
Well, I always just go with, record at the highest quality and then, down convert later.
But is mono lower quality or just separation of channel?
It's separation, but it's combining them all together. I'm not at all debating. I don't really.
You are debating, though.
No, I'm not.
I'm kidding.
By the way, we're still live on the Hangout.
I know.
I don't care.
I know. This is about making stuff, man.
I know. No, I'm saying, I'm just letting you know, remind you.
This is stuff that our 23 subscribers love to watch us doing right now.
I don't think anybody watches this part, though.
No. But, once it gets big later, then people might come back in time and start watching these things. And
we'll come back in time and watch and go, what the hell were we doing?
Oh, I know.
Delete a few of those.
Yeah.
Do we have a 1021? No.
10:21. What?
Today's not 10:21.
No, it's certainly not.
It's 28.
10:28.
Hey,
What's
we
bro-
did actually start before midnight. Because last time I think we started like 12:10.
We did.
always
We would have
laugh.
started an hour earlier if my machine hadn't blown up several times.
But I always laugh if you say the date, and every time I'm like, no, that's not the right date. We've already passed that date. We're lying. We're not recording on that day.
No,
We actually start today.
we were totally just waiting on me. My machine was just acting up, and we could have gotten started at like 10:15, like started recording. We totally could have done 2 episodes tonight.
We definitely started to get into it, so.
Well, this one ended up being an hour and a half, so maybe we couldn't have, but
Well, yeah. But I think we could have started to take it, and then we could have almost kept recording, and then you could have made 2 episodes, kind of.
yeah.
Because we were just kind of starting it, so.
Yes. Well, yeah. I want us to. I'm not against making 2 episodes out of just one conversation, but I would like us to kind of all agree that this conversation is over, and then we can cut and edit this one, and then move on to the next one, just so we're all on the same page, and we're not like, I kind of assume we're talking into the next episode, and you're still talking in the old episode, right? So, how about this? I'm going to, when you guys send it to me tonight, assuming it gets uploaded quickly, or downloaded to my machine, more specifically, quickly, I'm just going to very quickly just mix them together and send them back to you. And you guys can listen to them and just kind of send me notes on what you think should be cut out or left in or whatever, and then I'll go and do the editing. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
So I'm going to try to edit this, get this published before I go away this weekend. I'm leaving on Monday afternoon.
You're just going on vacation, right? You're not going.
Yeah, just for the week. So I'm going to try and get it out.
You have no connectivity, right?
What?
You're going somewhere you're going like South Carolina or something, right?
No, I'm going to Disney World, but I'm going to be. Yeah, no, I'm going to be like.
Well, then you definitely won't have any connectivity.
I'm not going to. Yeah.
Your body won't work at the end of the day.
I'll have email and I'll have Skype on my phone, but yeah, I'm going to be busy all day, and then I'm going to come home and crash and then wake up and do it again. So I'm not doing anything. I'm probably not even going to bring my laptop, although I don't believe that for a second.
I'm sure your little ones will keep you busy.
Yeah. Can we do another episode this week?
Thursday I could do. But I mean on Git or what?
Yeah, on Git. What do you think, Chris?
Well, what are we going to talk about for an hour on Git? No, I'm
We
serious.
did an hour on nulls. We have no shortage of time spent talking on things.
But have you guys used it a lot?
No.
Oh yeah, I use it. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I use it every day. If you're concerned about time on Git, which I'm not at all concerned about time on Git, then we can combine Git and TFS. We can basically do a complete comparison. We can start out with just like, if you want to chop out centralized versus distributed, which I'm not against at all, from this discussion, we can start out that discussion about with that, right? Defining centralized and distributed. And we can say, you probably use, so if you've been developing for more than 5 years, you probably use Subversion, probably use TFS, or you probably use CVS, regardless of what language you're in. If you're a Microsoft developer, you probably use TFS. And then if you've used like any open source stuff, you've probably used GitHub, which means that you've used Git. So let's talk about them, the differences. So first and foremost, they're centralized versus distributed, and then blah, 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 blah.
Yeah,
I think
I
you were
see
saying
people who are really frustrated with Git and GitHub. Like I see some folks on my Twitter timeline that are just like, I really hate Git. It's stupid. And
why?
Why? They don't. It's Twitter, dude. There's only 140 characters. I don't know why.
I found an awesome. This is actually the site that I use to learn Git. An awesome site called thinklikeagit.com or .net. And on this site, he's hilarious, but he's got a point. He has a whole section. It's like a big tutorial. It's basically like an ebook, kind of like on the web. But he says he compares it. He's got a section where people say Git is easy to understand if you just think of it like X, and there's like a bunch of them. And so he says one of them is, it's easy if you understand graph theory. If you understand graph theory, then it's really easy to understand Git.
Like everyone knows that.
It's easy to understand if you think of it as it's hopped up on acid, holding a chainsaw, completely insane and quite dangerous, but capable of exposing entirely new states of mind.
I think what I like the idea of is starting out with sort of just what are the different types, and then we can sort of dive in, maybe comparison and stuff. From my point of view is, like, sell me on the idea why in my day-to-day work I want to use Git. Because ultimately, to me, most developers, they just use whatever is provided for them. They're not going to go have that debate with their boss. Unless they're at sort of my level, would I be open to having that debate, but only if it's really going to change the problems I see.
If it's going to give you productivity. It all comes down to productivity, right? The tools that you use all comes down to productivity and solving the problem properly.
Because like Chris said before, if people have already paid for TFS, it's really hard to sell something else, even though it's free.
It's not as hard because TFS, even with TFS, you can make Git repositories now.
Well, yeah, that's the how you kind of finish it up is
right.
Even the TFS team is realizing that there is value in having this decentralized thing. They're moving their tool to do that, which to me Microsoft makes perfect sense because they're providing value.
No, there's also a tool to interact with a TFS source control repository as a Git repository.
Yeah, that TF-Git tool.
Yep.
Have you tried that? Because it looked like a disaster to me.
It's incredibly painful.
But
if you love Git, if in the course of this conversation we say one of the big things about the distributed source control in Git is that you can make these local changes and rewrite them and blah, 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 right? You can rewrite that history and squash it into one commit. All of that is true with Git TF.
Okay.
Right?
Or even like to me, the two features that are not in TFS or Subversion are squashing and rebasing.
So you can't rebase. You can't go back in history behind what's in.
Yeah.
Basically, you can't force, right? You can't force push anything because you can't change TFS history.
So but for me, rebasing, because rebasing and that rebase command does more than one thing. But for me, rebasing is saying, I've started some work and then Jess did some commits under me, but I like what he did. You know what I wish? I wish that I had a time machine and I could have started work after he finished.
Yeah.
Then you do the git rebase -I think, and it undoes your work, fast forwards your merges, puts your work back on top, and it looks and feels like you started after Jess.
Yeah, it does that. It does that.
So as long as Git thing will do it.
Yeah, as long as you think of the TFS server side as set in stone and you can't change anything,
right?
And the head, then everything is exactly the same.
Because I know you can use you use the rebase command for multiple things, and so like when I get to my, I have complaints about Git too, and then I have things that I like, and the thing is in the end, it has very little to do with being distributed. What I personally prefer when I start working on something now, like the first thing I do is make the GitHub repo, and I'm talking about personal projects.
Yeah.
A personal project, I'll go to github.com, I'll make the repo, I'll clone the repo down to my desktop and say, all right, I'm going to start working. And then I don't care if I delete it off my system. Who cares? It's up in the cloud. I'm good with it.
Yeah. I call that step 0. I literally I don't say file new project. I say GitHub new repo GitHub, and then clone it and then start.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, is that a Git thing, or is that just that the GitHub guys did a fantastic job? And a lot of it is the latter.
No, but even still, even if I'm making a local folder, the first thing I'll do is get in it, right?
But it sounds like we should have hit the record button before talking about that.
So. We're still recording. We're broadcasting.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
No, we should have. Yeah, right. We should stop talking now. Yeah. We have one viewer, by the way. Is one of you connected watching?
No.
Okay. Hi, Aaron.
Actually, well, no, because we changed the link. So the link that I published to...
There's probably a Google bot or something, bot flying around that finds things.
A bot.
What is the link?
If you're a legitimate viewer, welcome, legitimate viewer.
We have a YouTube channel.
Oh, did I put that up? Okay.
Yes. It says, do you want my permission? So I say cancel.
Okay. All right.
Q&A is disabled. What?
I know. I can't enable it. I think I got to enable it in the beginning before we start.
You should email Hanselman and say, how do you do the community stand-up?
Yeah, I know. So we have this podcast, and we record every week on Google Hangouts.
Actually, it's funny. You should be like, hey, we're just starting out. Any pointers? Listen for 10 minutes.
I'm going to.
Well, it's not even like it's one thing to say, hey, look at what they do. It's another thing to be like, how are they doing it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Because they're using Hangouts, and when it starts, he tweets out a link where he's like, join the community stand up now, and people come on. I mean, and when not only do they come on, they get to like, there's a little timeline that goes by, and you can hit green or red, and when you hit green, it like means that you like what they said. It's like a little pulse meter.
Yeah.
And then there's also, you can start putting in questions, and the questions start going up on the side, and you can +1 them.
We
And
have
then-
that. I mean, that's the Q&A plugin. That's not
Yeah.
enabled, but we can
And then
enable it.
eventually Scott starts like ordering them and saying, okay, current question, and Damien will answer it, and then he'll clear it and move on to the next one.
Yeah. It's just frustrating me that I literally can't even like click on the viewer to see who it is. So if you're watching and you can hear us, you should email me. Email me at comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. I want to know who you are.
You have your lower third working.
Or go on Twitter. Yeah, sure, because I use Twitter all the time. All right.
Why did you need that lower third?
So,
Yeah, you really needed that.
well, because you need to know my name and my picture.
Oh yeah, I guess that's true. That picture's current too.
No, it's it's like
Pictures from
years
when you were
old.
17.
yeah. All right. So, Chris, you never answered. Are you going to be able to record this week, or is that too much?
What day did we say? Did we say Thursday?
Thursday. Todd said Thursday.
I think Thursday's doable.
Okay. And doing
Friday's probably Halo 5, so no.
getting TF. I'm playing with you. It's downloading right now. It's already done. I'm playing.
I'm not playing now.
No, not now. It's downloaded now. We can play tomorrow.
Yes.
Could play tomorrow.
Yes. So this is our schedule.
Halo on tomorrow.
Halo. Halo. Prepare for the podcast. Record the podcast. Halo.
Yes.
Yeah, and
just repeat.
then go to Summit.
And
So
then go to
we
Summit.
have one rule though, Jess.
What?
You need to make sure your audio works by 10:15.
I started at 9:30. I started screwing around with all the hardware before you even got on, and then it took me another freaking hour and a half. No, well, I threw away the Mac, and then as soon as I threw away the Mac, look at me. Everything works now.
Oh,
Wait, what did you do to get the lower third working? Did you switch to
I
Firefox?
switched machines. No, I didn't switch Firefox. I switched machine, and I killed that Hangout. Because when I first joined on this new machine on that old Hangout, it still didn't work. I killed the new Hangout and started on a new one. So we just have to start the Hangouts over and over again until it works.
so violent.
All right, so I think you don't think we have enough to talk about, have a
No.
solid conversation about just Git?
It's not that I don't disagree at all. It's just that it sounds like in a way like the first one we talked a little bit more theoretically about what you should and shouldn't do, and then we could dive into some features. Because I'll tell you one thing, I use TFS at one job for like a year and a half, and then at Technicos for less than a year, and I don't have a lot of experience with it. I have a lot more with Subversion, which there was a specific reason why I liked CVS and Subversion in 2005. Today I hate them. So, like, I've undergone a transformation.
Yeah.
But the specific reason that I liked them was they were different from, like, SourceSafe in a way, because a lot of organizations were still using SourceSafe in like 2003, 2004, 2005.
Yeah.
And then
Glory wasn't still in it.
and then now it's like, God, I mean, I use Subversion today at work, and there are things I just can't stand. I just hate.
And by using SourceSafe, you mean losing their code on a regular
That's only
basis?
happened to me once, but it has happened. I know that it's a thing. I
Yeah,
know
it
that it's a thing.
So why do you guys still use Subversion? That's just what's entrenched.
At my particular organization, because okay, so here's what's really happening. There's a conversion
Remember you're
going on. That's okay. There's a conversion going on from Subversion to Git. It's not instant. There is just a lot of processes in place. They work. It's really hard to make the investment of like, okay, we move this and then we got to change automated build, automated deploy, automated whatever, automated. People know where stuff is. Even little friction like that, right?
So, yeah, it's entrenched.
Yeah,
So
it's
you're moving, but it's not instantaneous. So you have to live with the current environment.
Right.
Sounds
Well,
like you may end up with stuck in some things. Will always be there.
I really prefer when, like, let's say I'm going to work on something at work. Part of my happiness goes down to, is that on the SVN side or the Git side? Oh, it's on the Git side. I'm going to enjoy this much more. And if it's on the SVN side, I'm like, oh.
Just because of the developers who are attracted to either?
No, it's
Literally just the source
something about the workflow that I have built for myself that I can't replicate on the Subversion side.
Huh.
And, we'll talk about it. It'll be a show. Look, I admit it's a little, Git people will crucify me. Linus will say you're ugly and stupid.
Well, I don't think Linus is going to find our podcast. But if you are Dude Linus, please share it across.
If you're the one listening, then
I think ultimately the reason why we're making this podcast is we don't live in an ivory tower. We have to live in the real world. In our real world, it's a Microsoft world. I mean, you very easily could have TFS there.
Yeah,
have a lot of the same issues you have.
Right. And I like that philosophy of saying, instead of being academic about .NET and Microsoft, like, what are the demons we have to fight? The real ones. It's kind of neat. It's kind of different, I think.
All right. So are we recording tonight or not?
Not tonight. Not tonight. I gotta go to sleep.
Thursday at 10.
I'm operating on 3 hours of sleep already.
Yeah, me too.
He really wants to go play more Halo, but he has to sleep.
No, I gotta go to sleep.
How?
Why did you add Google Effects this time?
No, I'm just trying to see if we can I just want to add like a tag, just text, just add a tag that's like Static Void Podcast on the top. You know what I'm saying?
I don't think there's anything custom. You'd have to build something.
Oh, I'll build something. I'm a developer.
Oh, God.
I guarantee that it's not very well documented. I did briefly look at how to build a plugin.
How hard could it be?
There is nothing here. There has to be ones out there people have created.
Oh, here, custom overlay? Although, is it just for me? Let's see.
Where do you see custom?
Custom overlay.
I see beach, temple.
Oh, can you guys put your addresses in the OneNote?
What are
addresses?
Your mailing addresses.
No. Physical mailing addresses?
Yes.
Why?
Because I want to send you something.
What do you want to send us?
You will see when you get it.
You probably actually should know my mailing address.
Yeah, never mind. For you, I'll just walk it over to you.
No, where do you want it?
Just wherever in the OneNote somewhere.
In general?
Sure. That sounds like a great place.
Administrative. I'll put it in the administrative section.
Oh, I put it in wherever.
All right.
Yeah, Chris. Jess and I live like 10 minutes away from each other. And before we started doing podcasts, we only ever saw each other at the user group.
All right. It's added to wherever.
Okay. My address is down in the administrative section.
Thank you.
I don't get much mail, so I'll know it's from you.
Source control.
So my file's uploaded.
Oh, yeah. I think mine is too.
It only became 300 megabytes.
I didn't bother zipping it.
You're evil.
Yes, they're uploaded. And then I put my notes, too, because you might find links in there. You might not. Let's see.
So your glasses are like perfectly centered for the...
Actually, none of those links really matter all that much. I guess if we talk about Git and we do the whole Linus spiel again, or if you just cut and paste it into the next podcast, then you can. There's a video that was famous where he talked to Google about Git and he told them that Subversion was stupid.
Well, you were playing it, right, when we were waiting for Jess?
I was playing it earlier, yeah.
Subversion is stupid.
Yeah, and then...
Agreed.
All right, now it's going downhill.
still think that's what we need to have.
Actually, I saw the opening where I.
Just
Because I think the developers thing deserves a lead out.
Yeah, I know. You mean like a club mix?
I don't know, but it needs a lead out. So like,
Well, Audacity has auto-tune. I tried to auto-tune it. It didn't. It didn't come out the way I expected it.
I like how it starts, right? The first maybe 4 seconds, and then it needs a lead out.
I know.
you need Acrylics.
It needs music. You said this last time, and I was waiting for you to do something. I'm not going to do it.
I went looking.
But I completely agree with you.
I went looking for music, and I haven't found any yet.
Developers.
And the thing that really gets me is that one guy kind of nailed it. I don't know what song that was, but I thought he got it.
Yeah, do that again. That was. What did you? Where was that? Yeah.
Can I just license this?
He probably just his mix.
Yeah, do that, but do it better. That one's kind of obnoxious.
Why? 'Cause it becomes too much.
Screaming? Yeah.
Here you go, Jess. Just have your little girls sing something and record it.
Yeah, have them say developers.
Yeah, exactly.
Developers.
No, it's got to be some track we can use.
Now can I play on the iPad?
No, Daddy's trying to record. With the emphasis on try.
Okay, I'm going to sleep.
Yes.
Oh, yes. All right.
Thursday at 10.
I had forgotten about sleep. Yeah,
Yep.
Thursday at 10.
Nice camera, Jess.
What?
If you guys play Halo, I'll be on maybe tomorrow.
Hold on, I'm going to try. Hold on one minute.
What are you trying?
I'm just trying to. You don't have to stay around for this, I guess.
All right, get some sleep.
Hold on.
All right,
Halo.
later.
Halo at 10 or something like that.
What? Yeah, 10. Halo at 10 tomorrow night.
Probably between 9 and 10 is probably when I'll play.
Cool. I'll send a Google Hangout.
All right.
And then I'll try and get my machine working.
Then we'll wait 45 minutes while you try to get recording to work.
All right.
See you guys.
No, not PDN.